The moving truck rumbled down the cracked asphalt of the rural road, jostling my belongings in the back and sending a few boxes tumbling into each other. I peered out the passenger window at the sprawling fields of wheat swaying in the breeze, a mesmerizing sea of golden green. I had moved countless times before, but this was different. This was the kind of small-town isolation I had longed for, a chance to escape the frenetic pace of city life and start anew. I felt a mix of excitement and trepidation as we approached the old farmhouse I had rented. My friends had warned me about living so far from civilization, but I craved the tranquility that came with solitude. I had spent years in a bustling city, constantly surrounded by people, noise, and chaos. This farmhouse was a breath of fresh air, a chance to reconnect with myself. As we pulled into the driveway, I took a deep breath, the scent of earth and grass filling my lungs. The house loomed before me, weathered and charming, with its chipped paint and sprawling porch. It had been vacant for years, and I could sense the history woven into its very walls. The creaking floorboards and dusty corners had stories I was eager to uncover. "Are you sure about this place?" the driver asked, raising an eyebrow as he unloaded the first box. "Absolutely," I replied, forcing a smile to mask my nerves. "It's perfect for me." I spent the next few days unpacking and settling in, filling the empty rooms with the remnants of my former life. My furniture, books, and personal touches transforming the vacant space into a home. As night fell, I would sit on the porch sipping tea and listening to the sounds of the countryside. Crickets chirping, the distant call of an owl, and the rustle of leaves in the wind. It was peaceful, but as the days turned into weeks, the tranquility of my new life began to shift. I started noticing things that made my skin crawl. It began subtly, an inexplicable feeling of being watched. At first, I brushed it off as paranoia, the remnants of my city-dwelling anxiety. But as time passed, I could no longer ignore it. I would catch fleeting glimpses of movement in the shadows of the trees lining my property. Once, while unpacking in the late afternoon, I saw a figure dart behind a tree. My heart raced as I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light. But that evening, as I sat on the porch, I felt the weight of someone's gaze. "Maybe it's just a neighbor," I muttered to myself, trying to quell the growing unease. But deep down, I knew I was alone in this vast expanse of land, with no neighbors in sight. The closest house was a mile away, and I was completely surrounded by fields and woods. One evening, while I was cooking dinner, I heard a soft tapping on the window. My heart leapt into my throat as I turned, expecting to see an animal or perhaps a stray branch. Instead, I found nothing. I shook my head, blaming my jumpy nerves and the creeping sense of isolation. Yet, the tapping continued, each time louder and more insistent. I began to dread those moments, and the thought of closing the curtains crossed my mind more than once. I hated feeling this way, vulnerable, exposed, but something primal in me urged caution. Then, one night, as I was settling in for bed, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside my window. The soft crunch of leaves echoed in the stillness, sending chills racing down my spine. I lay frozen in my bed, listening intently. The footsteps stopped, and an icy dread washed over me. "Just the wind," I whispered to myself, but my heart told me otherwise. I gathered the courage to peek through the curtains. I had to know if someone was out there. What I saw sent a wave of nausea crashing over me. A silhouette stood at the edge of my property, just outside the range of the porch light. It was too dark to see clearly, but I could make out the outline of a figure, tall and still. My breath quickened as I ducked away from the window, heart pounding in my ears. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, but I was certain that they were watching me. Fear coursed through my veins, and I struggled to collect my thoughts. Should I call someone? Did I even have anyone to call? In a frenzy, I dialed 911, my fingers trembling as I pressed the buttons. I could barely articulate my fear to the operator, stuttering about someone outside my house. The operator assured me that help was on the way, but as I hung up, a gnawing sense of dread settled in my stomach. Minutes felt like hours as I waited, hyper-aware of every sound outside. The footsteps had stopped, but I felt the presence lingering, a dark cloud hanging over me. I heard the distant wail of a siren, and relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by anxiety. What if the figure was gone by the time they arrived? When the police finally pulled up, their lights flashing, I rushed outside to meet them, barely able to contain my panic. "There's someone out there," I exclaimed, pointing toward the edge of my property. The officers exchanged glances but nodded, following me to the spot where I had seen the figure. They searched the perimeter of my yard, flashlights illuminating the darkness. "Are you sure you saw someone?" one officer asked, his tone skeptical. "I swear I did. They were right there," I insisted, my voice shaking. After a thorough search, the officers returned, looking somewhat bemused. "We didn't find anyone. Are you sure it wasn't just an animal or a trick of the light?" I felt a surge of frustration and fear. "No, it was a person. I know what I saw. We recommend keeping your doors locked and being cautious, but there's nothing we can do unless you have more information," the officer said, his voice firm but sympathetic. The officers left, and I returned to the house feeling defeated. I locked the doors and turned off all the lights, retreating to the bedroom. But sleep eluded me, and I lay awake staring at the ceiling, haunted by the thought of someone lurking in the darkness. In the days that followed, my anxiety only deepened. I began to see the figure more frequently, always at a distance, just outside the perimeter of my property. I would catch sight of movement in the trees, but by the time I turned to look, nothing would be there. The isolation that had once felt comforting now turned into a suffocating prison. I tried to focus on unpacking, cleaning, and adjusting to my new life, but my thoughts were consumed by the creeping dread that something was watching me. One afternoon, I decided to take a break and go for a walk to clear my head. I ventured down the long, winding path that led through the fields, hoping the fresh air would lift my spirits. As I walked, I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, convincing myself it was just my imagination. But the moment I stepped into the woods, the sensation intensified. I felt eyes on me, every rustle of leaves making me jump. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding as I navigated the narrow path. Suddenly, I heard a branch snap behind me. Panic surged through me as I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the oppressive stillness of the woods. I turned back and resumed my hurried walk, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere. That's when I noticed something on the ground. A small, weathered object, half buried in the dirt. I knelt down to inspect it, and my breath caught in my throat. It was a small locket, tarnished and old. As I opened it, a sense of unease washed over me. Inside were two faded photographs, a young couple smiling and carefree. I closed the locket, feeling a chill run down my spine. I didn't want to dwell on who it belonged to or how it ended up here. I hurried back to the farmhouse, the weight of the locket heavy in my pocket. I was convinced it must be linked to the figure that haunted me. As I reached the porch, I took one last glance at the surrounding woods, feeling the oppressive weight of the shadows. That night, I decided to do some research about the history of the farmhouse. I spent hours scouring online resources, digging into its past, hoping to find some answers about the figure I had been seeing. As I searched, I stumbled upon an old newspaper article detailing a tragic event that had occurred years ago. A young couple who had lived in the house had mysteriously disappeared. The article was vague, citing the case as unsolved, with no leads or explanations. My heart raced as I read through the details. The couple had been well liked in the community, but after their disappearance, the farmhouse had been left to decay, a shadow of its former self. I felt a chill wash over me as I pieced together the story. Was the figure I had seen a manifestation of their lingering presence? Or was it someone else entirely, taking advantage of the house's dark history? That night, sleep eluded me again. I lay in bed, the locket heavy on my chest, feeling the oppressive silence of the house around me. Every creak of the floorboard sent my heart racing, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The following day, I decided to confront my fears head-on. I took the locket with me and ventured into the woods once more, determined to find the truth. I followed the path leading to the area where I had found it, the sun filtering through the trees, casting eerie shadows on the ground. As I reached the clearing, I took a deep breath, my heart racing. "If you're here, show yourself," I called out, my voice trembling. Silence enveloped me. I felt foolish standing there in the middle of the woods, holding a locket and demanding to see a ghost, but I needed to know. Just as I turned to leave, I heard a whisper, "Help us." My blood ran cold, and I spun around, heart pounding. "Who's there?" I shouted, but there was no answer. The voice had been soft, almost pleading, and it echoed in my mind. I took a step back, fear gripping me, but then something caught my eye. There, just beyond the trees, I saw a flash of movement, a figure darting away. Without thinking, I followed, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I pushed through the underbrush, branches scratching my skin, desperation driving me forward. The figure led me deeper into the woods, and I struggled to keep pace. Just as I thought I was closing the gap, the figure slipped behind a massive oak tree. I rounded the trunk, breathless, but found nothing. The woods were silent once more, leaving me alone with my racing heart. Panic flooded me. Had I imagined it? Had it all been in my head? I took a moment to steady myself, but as I turned to head back, I felt it again, the sensation of being watched. In that moment, I realized I couldn't stay in the farmhouse any longer. The peace I had sought had turned into a nightmare, and I could no longer dismiss the feeling of being hunted. I had to leave. I made my way back to the farmhouse, tears streaming down my face. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been drawn into something dark and malevolent. I packed my belongings, trembling as I gathered my life into boxes. As I prepared to leave, I glanced at the locket one last time. I didn't know what I had stumbled upon in that house, but I was determined to break free. The moving truck arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the fields. I felt a sense of relief as I loaded my belongings into the back, leaving behind the farmhouse that had become a prison. As we drove away, I looked back at the house, a silhouette against the darkening sky. I could feel the weight of its history, the lives lost in the shadows that lingered. But as we turned down the road, I finally felt a sense of freedom wash over me. I had escaped the darkness, the suffocating fear that had haunted me. I would start anew, leaving the past behind and embracing a future free from the shadows. As the farmhouse faded from view, I took a deep breath, ready to face whatever came next, knowing I had the strength to overcome it all.